Hello and welcome to another episode of Flying High with Flutter. I'm your host, allenwyma. Before we start the show, as always, just wanted to give a shout out. So the sponsor of this podcast is, of course, my consulting company called Plangora. So if you guys are in need of any kind of services in Flutter, Elixir, or Rust, do feel free to reach out. Head over to our website at www.plangora.com. That's Plangora.com, and contact us if you're interested in some services. And anyways, back to the main show. We have today a extremely interesting person. Definitely his product is super interesting and something maybe I'll look into. Rayli, he is the owner, creator of Codelessly, which is a tool to convert Figma designs into working code in Flutter. And yeah, that would be my pitch, I think, to say how your app is. Why don't you go ahead and give a quick intro who you are and maybe a quick intro about the product.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, for having me on your podcast. Lots of interesting things to discuss today. A little bit about myself. So I've been developing apps for over 10 years. I developed Android apps initially for 6 years in a professional capacity. And for the past 4 years, I've been working with Flutter. And I started Codelessly about 2 years ago because Flutter finally gave me an opportunity to solve some really long running app development problems that I haven't seen solved and I didn't believe was possible to solve. But Flutter, a new platform, new technology, and it's really exciting. Which is why I started Codelessly. So a little bit about myself, a little bit about Codelessly. So Codelessly, as Alan mentioned, it's a design and development automation company. Our core product is an editor that converts Figma designs into apps, websites, and production-ready code.
I also want to kind of notice that your tool is still being worked on at the moment, right? So please don't go rushing to his website. The only thing you can do is sign up, but I do promote you guys to go ahead and sign up. So you did, I'll go ahead and give a disclosure. I don't think it's a big deal that you did walk me through the current working version at the time. It was still rough, but actually not as rough as most people's products are at a beta time. So I have to say that overall it looks pretty good. It's pretty polished, I think. But yeah, like maybe we can kind of talk a little bit more about your background, right? Because I think it's always good to hear like, the story about you, because that's going to lead into why did you create Codelessly. I think there must be something there that sparked this whole entire desire, right? So you're originally from US, right? But you're in a place that is not really thought about too much, right? It's very, very local, I would say. You're out in Kansas City, I believe, right?
Right. I'm actually in Lawrence, Kansas. So,
Sorry, not too far from KC. That's my fault. I remember we talked about KC around the time.
oh yeah, no worries. Yeah, a suburb of the home of the University of Kansas, the Jayhawks. You might know of them. College football. College basketball. So yeah, a little bit about my background. I've been doing app development for a long time, for over 10 years. And I started out developing Android apps. And if you developed Android, you know that there's a lot of constraints, there's a lot of limitations. And why do those limitations exist? It's because you're building something on top of the Android system. So you're hooking into the activities, the app lifecycle. You're hooking into their XML views. You're bound by their constraints, like the background services. Android has previously, had the background services. Now we have a more modern version called like work managers. You have all of the existing infrastructure and tools that Android gives you, but it's very, very constraining and oftentimes limiting. So I developed quite a few Android apps and libraries. If you look at my GitHub profile, I've published like 6 or 7 different Android libraries. I'm a big believer in open source. We can talk a little bit about open source, and open source is in a really interesting place with a lot of emerging business models and actually like venture funding going into open source companies. And it's interesting to see the evolution of that space in the past, just like 1 or 2 years, and think about how it's going to evolve going forward. But yeah, so I developed Android apps. I got really, really tired of uh, all of these things that I wanted to do that I couldn't do. Um, so, like very simple things like restoring state. Um, you needed to like be almost an expert, and even if you're an expert, you needed to make a lot of your own libraries, classes to be able to just jump the user right back into where they were after your app has been destroyed. Something that simple turns out to be so incredibly difficult. Um, and another thing like analytics, observability, you don't really get the best tooling in the mobile development space. So in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking about, okay, how can I develop, some better tools to allow people to build better apps, to allow me to build better apps. And Android is just so incredibly, uh, I guess, um, things change a lot in Android, and sometimes not for the better. Um, like the notification system. Every year, there's a new API revamp, there's new deprecations. Oh, the deprecations, right? So, yeah, just lots of problems with Android. So, when Flutter came along, uh, I was really impressed. The thing that sold me on Flutter, Alan, is the drop shadows. So, are you aware of like how Android does drop shadows versus how iOS and Flutter are able to do drop shadows?
My background in Android is just using basic components, so those typical, first level apps that everybody does where they all look the same. That was how my app looked. Uh, I mean, because I first did an iOS app and I used Interface Builder, and thought that was a good experience. But then when I went to Android to create the same app, I was a little bit shocked that like, oh, I have to use XML. What is this, like 1980 something? Like, I was a little bit confused about why this was the moment, but this was years ago, at least 10 years ago. So no, I have no idea how you actually can do some very customized components within Android. So maybe you can give everybody the background.
Yeah, sure. Um, so um, I've made a few custom views. There are a few ways to build custom Android components. One is you can compose XML using the existing components, right? So essentially, the same way you would in Flutter, you'd reuse containers, you'd reuse, styling containers. You reuse the existing widgets to build your custom views. That's all in XML. That's pretty simple to do, but you quickly run into a need where you'll need to write your own layout traversal, essentially. So there's a few layout override methods that you can hook into the Android system. You can extend the view class. So extending the view class, you now get the layout sizing. You can then take that sizing and use it to calculate your own bounds. And then from there, there's 2 paths that you can go. One is you can continue to use the Android provided widgets like text, linear layouts, relative layouts, etc. but you control the sizing, you control the layout yourself, given the values provided to you by that view. Or if you're doing something more custom, you can actually do canvas paint. In Android, there's the ability to paint things onto the canvas, to draw things, using vectors. Android's vector composition capabilities is actually quite advanced, a bit more advanced than Flutter's. So that's, I guess, somewhat quick and dirty deconstruction of how you would build like a custom view.
But now they have this thing called Jetpack Compose now. Isn't that similar to how Flutter works, is what I've heard, but I've never actually seen it yet. I just see the words. Have you looked at that to see what that's all like?
Oh no, I actually haven't looked into Jetpack Compose. I'm pretty fully on board with Flutter now. I mean, you're touching, Alan, on the limitation of Android, right? So the reason a lot of Android, the biggest limitation, one of the biggest limitations of Android was the XML, because XML is static, right? So the moment you want to create anything dynamic, you're somewhat out of luck, because Android, it's the app is compiled, so you can't really change things at runtime. Which means if you want to create dynamic layouts, what you're essentially doing is you're building Flutter. You're defining a series of mappings between data structures to generate layouts, right? So it's essentially, Flutter essentially solves like so many of the Android problems.
You think it's really such a problem is it really such a problem? Because I mean, there's still a lot of people doing native Android apps, right? Like I still know a lot of developers who just say, no, this is already great. It could be because they never actually tried out Flutter, but do you think it really is such a problem?
I think if you want to do, like advanced architectural or framework level development, a Flutter is a lot more accessible in that way. So what I mean by that is, in Flutter, the work that I can do, the work that I do in Flutter, and like on Codelessly, and also in some of my own projects, the equivalent of that in Android would be me going and working on the Jetpack Compose team, or me going and working at JetBrains to help develop Kotlin, the language itself. So we want to be doing that type of work and thinking at that level and trying to build those capabilities. But it's a lot more, like, you can do it in Flutter. You can do it, Alan. Anyone can do it, in Flutter. But with Android, there's a lot more, like, I guess, super glued pieces together, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing, like the stuff that you can do with Flutter. It's really like the limit is your own imagination, I would say. I mean, of course, there's some limitation in the platform, but the idea of composability, it's like, okay, you add this, and then it's kind of limited really by your mind and how you can compose things, which I think is super interesting. All right, I kind of want to roll back a little bit, right? So what actually brought you to Flutter, like, to begin with, right? Because it can't just be that one day, like, it just kind of was installed on your machine and then you just accidentally opened it. There must have been some talk, something that was like, let me just take a look at this and see what this is, at least, right? I don't think you just saw it and said, this, like you said, the drop shadows. Oh, this is the tool for drop shadows. This is what I heard, right? So what kind of happened?
Well, I used to visit the Android dev Reddit quite a bit, because there's always, really good libraries, new libraries posted on there. So I visit the Android dev Reddit, and then in 2018 there was all this conversation about Flutter. Um, so uh, that's how Flutter got on my radar. What's funny is that I think in 2020 or something, so 2018 and then 2019, 2020, by that time, uh, the Android dev Reddit, like they banned Flutter content, so you can no longer post Flutter content on the Android dev Reddit. But initially you could, because we didn't have our own Flutter Reddit back then. So you had a lot of Flutter content on the Android dev Reddit, and that's how I got exposed.
What kind of things were they actually posting on there at the time? Was it just like different kinds of really interesting UIs, and kind of that's what started attracting to you, or?
So yeah, there was the really interesting like UI creations. A few discussions about. I mean, this is a really a few discussions about like state management, right, and the underlying architecture, like how does Flutter work? So state management, architecture. Flutter introduced the idea of state management for the most part to my vocabulary. Um, in the Android world, we call it, like architecture, right? So like model view controller, or at that time is MVVM, so model view view model. So there were a lot of discussions about, oh hey, what is Flutter doing? Like, what are some of the methods there? And find that really interesting. I still think it's really interesting. It's an open conversation. It should be. Like, there's definitely room for innovation there. Yeah, so that's a lot of what was posted. Um,
How was your first experience with it coming from Android? Like, and you must have followed some type of tutorial to kind of get started, or were you just kind of just playing around, or kind of what was your first not deep dive, but your first experience?
Definitely followed, the setup tutorials, and I just like voraciously consumed all of the tutorials, the code labs. I don't think there were code labs then, but just the guides about, how do you make, basic UI. At that time, it was all mostly UI tutorials. Like there was like little to no knowledge or any info about state management, except for yes, there was one code lab from Google about like how to manage state. I think it was with their I don't remember the app, but it was like a really convoluted and difficult example. Oh, with block, right? So the original OG implementation of block. Um, by Dieter Boulens. So that was one of the early authors of a lot of um, really influential and helpful Flutter articles and info. I don't think we don't see, he hasn't released any content for the last like 2 years, um, Dieter Boulens, but uh, yeah, so he had an article about block, but most of the state management info was like extremely convoluted at the time. And I actually didn't get it. So uh, I hit, the roadblock, or the wall, that a lot of people hit when they learn Flutter, the state management wall. And I just put Flutter aside for a month. So that was my experience. I loved the drop shadows. The drop shadows were the thing about the drop shadows is in Android, in material design, Google and does something really really odd with drop shadows. It uses physics, real physics, to to calculate drop shadows. So that means that it has a light source, and things that are closer to the light source have less shadow, while things further away from the light source have uh, bigger shadows. Now, that sounds cool in theory, but no designer and no user would really want that. Because what happens is if you assign a drop shadow with an elevation of, say, 2, at the very top, it's flat. You don't see any drop shadow at all. But at the very bottom, you see a drop shadow of like 8 pixels. And it's just crazy. It's insane. The fact is, it was just very, very peculiar, an Android peculiarity. So with Flutter, I was able to make iOS-style drop shadows that are just consistent. It doesn't matter where in the list, top or bottom it is. It's always going to look the same. That's what sold me on Flutter.
Yeah, I didn't know drop shadows were so interesting. It's kind of like, to me, it is something that, of course, I have to add sometimes. But yeah, I usually have to see it in the design and then just kind of eyeball it and then move on to the next component. But I can understand that drop shadows. I didn't know, you can make them so complicated. To me, that just, yeah, I mean, I've done them before, especially in CSS. So that's why I'm a little bit surprised that, yeah, that was a big thing for you. But we all have things that really attract us. So it sounds like that drop shadows in general from your past was just like a pain to really get right. That's really kind of what attracted you.
Right, right. Especially since this was back in the days when we had Gingerbread. That's Android 2.3. We had Gingerbread, Honeycomb, and then Ice Cream Sandwich, and then Lollipop, right? So between all of these versions, just things changed so much. So the Android API spec, you have drop shadows that look this way on a Lollipop. They look completely different on an older Android version. And that's part of the Flutter promise, right? So you build it and it looks the same no matter what platform on Android or iOS or web or desktop. And that promise is just so powerful and so beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty big goal. I now want to start to kind of lean back towards the main topic, right? So did you actually deliver some production Flutter apps before you started working on Codelessly, or was it just kind of playing around, or kind of what happened after you started getting into Flutter some more?
There is a production Flutter app I helped build that you can check out right now. I helped build the NoCD treatment app, OCD treatment app. So it's called NOCD. And if you have OCD or if you know anyone with OCD, that app provides digital telehealth treatment. So that app is now completely built in Flutter, and I helped build that app. So that's currently in production. It's used by over 50,000 people. And it's, well, if you have OCD or if you want to see a high quality, medical treatment app built in Flutter, definitely go check it out. So that's my production level work. But other than that, I played around with Flutter a bit, but Codelessly is it's going to be the Flutter app that I'll be building.
Okay, so I think I kind of want to start to kind of lead back towards the product, right? So what was it that gave you this inspiration to do Codelessly, right? Because that's a huge endeavor. You have to do a lot of stuff. Basically, most of your time is going to be at the beginning, at least, what they call shaving the yak, right? You have to dig into Flutter itself. You have to dig into Figma and how it all works. Creating a plugin, because you have a plugin that actually works with it. Understanding how Figma files work, I'm guessing. so that you can read the data and somehow translate that into Flutter. Like that's huge. Did you have any idea what you're getting into when you started this process?
Yeah, pretty. I think I had a pretty good idea. So you're just scratching the surface, Alan. It actually goes quite a bit deeper. So I knew from the very beginning that I wanted to pretty much write everything from the ground up. So my perspective is that to solve actual problems, you have to rethink pretty much everything. So you were just scratching the surface, just to give you an idea of like what, just how much work there is and just how deep it goes. I pretty much wrote our own state management system. I wrote our own code gen library. So we've built a production level code gen pipeline. So one thing I like to talk about in terms of the product is building pipelines. You can build a product, you can build features, but the actual foundational work in solving the actual problems is building a pipeline that to convert data, design data into code data. So yes, there is a tremendous amount of infrastructure work. Like just writing the state management library took like 5 to 6 months. The CodeGen library took, 3 to 4 months. And we also, one thing we're working on now that you saw a little bit of that is still quite a few, there's quite a few issues, is our layout engine. We wrote our own layout engine from the ground up, just to solve these fundamental problems, because we want to support exporting to HTML, and we also support exporting to Flutter. So there's layout discrepancies that have to be managed somehow, right? So maybe that gives you a little bit of idea about, yes, there is a lot going into Codelessly, but there's a lot more that we're doing in order to build it right and to solve the actual base essential problems.
So I mean, yeah, there's a lot of stuff, right? You did know what you're getting into before you started this, right? And you're fully
Yeah,
happy with all that. It's been what you said. Was it 2 years? Did you say or something? It's been
two
quite some time.
years.
Yeah. So what keeps you motivated? I mean, 2 years is a long time to stick on to one thing. Developers are known to leave a job after a year or so. So this is kind of more common these days. Like, how do you stay motivated to keep working on this?
It's really simple, Alan. Um, there's uh, there's two motivations primarily. One is what we're building here, like no one else is building. So we're trying to solve these problems that if we weren't solving, other people wouldn't be solving. And I refuse to I refuse to lower my quality standards. I don't want to use a tool that someone else has built that isn't of high quality. And like based on all the other um, website app builders I've seen, it doesn't do what I want it to do. And what I want to do is so very simple. Um, Maybe you can pull up the diagram, but all I want to do is be able to tell a design exactly how it works and just have it work. And that's it. Like the designer's already done the work of designing. Why can't I just take that design and have it be working code? So that's my first motivation. My second motivation is that we are essentially in a battle for the future of software development. There's AI on the horizon. There's a lot of threats to how developers work that I believe are very present and very pertinent. And there's a lot of differing perspectives on how the future of software development should be. And I want to have a say, and I want to fight for a future where we give developers control, we give regular people control, versus giving these closed source, no code tools or closed source apps, or giving it to those corporations. I think the balance and the future of software development is really at stake here.
I mean, looking at some of these other ones that are similar to what you have, what would actually come close to describing to people? Because, like we said, your product is still not out yet. You're kind of using it. You're actually kind of always testing it out. And I'm sure you also get inspiration. Of course, you must have checked the market to see what else is out there. Can you relate some other products that are very similar so people get an idea about what that would be like to actually work with this?
Okay, great. So our promise at Codelessly, the vision is extremely simple. So step one, you have your design from Figma. You have your design from Figma and eventually, Sketch and Adobe XD, right? So you have the design. It's there. You can see that, hey, there's a button, there's a list, there's an input field, there's a bottom bar, there's a scrollable. You can see all of these components, right? So why isn't there a tool that just lets me tell the design what to do and just have it work? And that's what Codelessly is supposed to be. So in step one, you import the design using our plugin from Figma. You import it into our editor. And then in step two, in our editor, we have we give you the ability to tell the design how it should work. So you can see that there's an input field. We'll give you the ability to tell it, hey, that's an input field. You'll also be able to easily compose rows and columns together. So if you select items that are in a row, our algorithm is smart enough to know that it's a row, and you can turn it into a row. And for the bottom bar, we have components as well that you can easily convert into a bottom bar into one of our bottom bar components.
Okay. Yeah, I do have a question about some of these things, right? Because I'm thinking back to when I had to work with designs. And I think one that came out to me immediately was the scroll bar, right?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of stuff, usually they really take like a rectangle. And when I say they, I mean those designers that always make developers' lives so difficult, The designers always, not always, but I remember sometimes they're actually just rectangles, right? So literally you can click on a rectangle within Codelessly and say this is a scroll bar. And this can actually translate over into actual working code, right?
Correct. Not with the specific scroll bar example, perhaps, but with list views. If you're talking about list views, yes, we can make things scrollable. We can make list views. We can make things scrollable. So those two specific use cases are definitely supported. And then, you can just take it and turn it into code.
Yeah, but I think it's also important to say not just code, right? We talked about this in our last meeting. It's actually relatively decent code, right? It's stuff that you would write yourself. Like I said to you before, I remember working years ago with Dreamweaver, and you try to lay out stuff and you get all this kind of crap code, and if you did it by hand, it would be maybe a third of what Dreamweaver would give you, and definitely much easier to work with. But what you did, and I believe you actually spent a ridiculous amount of time making this work, is try to make the code as developer written friendly right?
Right. So that's why we wrote our own CodeGen library. And we also were writing our own we wrote our own layout engine, because responsiveness, that's one area that like pretty much all of the existing tools fail at, right? They can't do responsiveness, and if they do responsiveness, it's their really bad like proprietary responsiveness code that you really can't use. Um, but what we've done with our own layout engine is we've made it so that it generates exactly the layout code, the responsive rows, the responsive columns, and text code that you would get if you wrote it yourself in Flutter. And also for HTML as well.
Can we talk a little bit about how can we make this responsive, right? So now we have these foldable devices coming out. So many things are happening at the moment. And also every single day you're going to get these kind of budget devices with very small screens, low resolution, and you're going to get these high-end devices with some, nowadays it used to be, or before in the past where it used to be kind of small screens. Steve Jobs was not a big fan of these phablets. But now phablets are back, even for Apple, since the last couple of years. And yeah, they're getting bigger. And then also there's the mini iPhones and these kind of things. Like, how can I use Codelessly to handle these things? Is it like I have to take a component and then somehow anchor it and say always stay a certain percentage from the sides? Or like how would I kind of handle these varying screen sizes?
So we drew inspiration from Flutter. And what Flutter does with responsiveness that it does very, very well is it's pretty much automatic. If you make a row in Flutter, and you wrap the text in flexibles to avoid those overflow errors, your row is going to be responsive. So that's our responsiveness philosophy. That's where we started from. We want to be, we're working to support. We're almost there, and we're working to support all the responsiveness that you can do inside of Flutter. But because we have our own layout engine, we actually go one step further. So in our V2, after we release, based on user demand, we can actually support additional responsiveness controls that Flutter itself can't even support. One example of that would be setting constraints on an item inside of a row or column. Flutter doesn't accept constraints on items inside rows and columns. It overrides it with the flex. But with our own layout engine, we can actually support that. So initially, what we'll be doing is we're just going to give you the controls to allow you to do responsiveness how Flutter would let you do it. Eventually, based on user research and feedback, we might create an intuitive responsiveness system that can supplement Flutter, that can supplement a web.
I think responsiveness is kind of the old, what I would say, the old school thing, right? Now we have to worry about adaptiveness, right? Maybe we can talk a little bit about responsive versus adaptive, and then talk about how Codelessly, you already start to handle some adaptive capabilities, I think, right? If I remember correctly from our last talk.
Yeah, adaptive is really simple, Alan, or comparatively simple. So there's two features with adaptiveness.
So can we first just define what is adaptive, right? Because maybe not everybody understands what that means. It's a relatively new term and really specific for Flutter, I think.
Right. So my understanding of adaptiveness, and this is what someone actually taught me. So Alois Daniels, he's a pretty famous Flutter developer. He's built a lot of really cool things. He actually I listened to one of his talks, and this is where I get the adaptiveness definition from. So responsiveness is responding to so the layout itself responds to screen size changes. Adaptive layouts is changing the layout in response to devices or screen sizes. I completely butchered that, but does that somewhat, do I somewhat get the gist?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say being adaptive is kind of like adjusting the interface to fit the platform, something like that. Yeah, so it's like the idea that on iPad you have more space, so you can show a sidebar, but not even just that, right? That's kind of a little bit more responsive. But the adaptive part is that you would use like a two-finger tap maybe to pull up a secondary menu. I think you could do that if I remember correctly. But in any case, you don't have a right click. You don't have hover. But if you take the same app and you export it to web or desktop, you have the ability at least to hover. You have a mouse, right? And so the idea is that you need to, depending upon the platform, you would offer native experiences to interact with it, right? Not just about, if it's this wide, then show this. If it's this wide, then do that. It's also, if this platform has these abilities, do this. Otherwise, don't. And I think that's kind of a huge part of it. And that definitely it can make some major changes to your app, right? Especially even for like iOS, Android. I mean, you could still, if this is iOS, use Cupertino. If this is Android, use Material, right? You can start this from the beginning.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think there's a lot of components that are, not a lot, but there's quite a few components in Flutter that already support similar things. Like I think what's it called, the switch? I don't remember what the name of component is within Flutter, but I believe switch, and then you can set adaptive, and depending upon which platform you're in, you're gonna get a native looking one, because like a switch in iOS looks different than a switch in Android. I think I saw a design. I think I saw something from somebody where they showed you're gonna see a checkbox within Android, but then you're gonna see a toggle switch within iOS, which is really quite different. But they work about the same. It's the idea of turning things off and on.
Right. That's interesting, Alan. You're completely right about how adaptiveness is related to the underlying platform that you're running the UI on. So you have adaptive layouts, and then you have a platform adaptiveness as well. And just in that like discussion right there, I think it goes to show how how complex UI can be, and also how UI isn't a solved problem yet. So that's what's really exciting. There's definitely room for so much innovation here, and there's so many problems that haven't been solved. Um, with that adaptive switch, what's really interesting is that's like one of the only examples of that Flutter really provides you with an adaptive component, and it ties into, as far as I know, it ties into the Flutter team's, I guess their philosophy. So at the very beginning, initially, it was like, okay, we want to give you these components that can look, native to iOS, and then also look native to Material, Android, and then you can just use them, and your life's easy. But users, actual developers, we ran into, I think, so many issues that maybe the Flutter team has somewhat given up on that philosophy, especially with the introduction of like web and Mac OS and also Windows. So now they're like, okay, we're gonna pull back a bit, perhaps on the UI components, and we'll let you, the community, make the UI components instead.
Yeah, there's been a ridiculous amount of people coming in. Like I think the last, what was it? The last Engage, right? When they said I think they said now it's production ready for Windows, if I remember correctly, right? And so they kind of came out and they said, "Oh, okay. We did you know that we also have a community-led library, so your app will actually look just like a real Windows app, like you're saying, right? This is adaptive in that case, right? Because you're expecting things to act and look a certain way, which is huge, right? I mean, if you could, wow, I mean, I think we're steering too much off the topic, but it would be really interesting to see, to see. Well, let's just see what do you actually handle right now. Let's talk about that, right? So you do some adaptability, right? So let's talk about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, our adaptiveness is pretty limited, but when I say limited, what I actually mean by that is we have the best in class. We have the capability that no other tool has. So that's what I mean by limited. So the adaptiveness support, we support adaptive layouts. One common use case that in my user research I've ran into is you export a landing page from Figma, and designers develop both mobile and a desktop version. So you import both of those into Codelessly, and with a single button click, you can actually set the breakpoints. So you can show the desktop layout on screen sizes larger than, say, 480, and you can show the mobile layout on screen sizes smaller than 480 pixels wide. And our library supports that already. So it supports that breakpoints. We support breakpoints, and we support breakpoint layout switching.
So you can only limit these on the screen sizes, not on the platform itself?
Not yet.
Okay, that's still pretty huge. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry. Limiting based on, say, a platform, that will actually tie into our variant feature. So we want to give users the ability to create different layout variants based on variables and based on these different properties.
Okay, what kinds of properties would clarify to be a variant?
Yeah, so let's say you had a rating, a bar, right? So you have 5 stars, 5 stars in a rating bar. You see these rating bars, in the App Store. You see it, on Google Maps. You see it, whenever someone wants feedback. Hey, how did we do, right? So you have this UI component, 5 stars. Well, you pass it a variable called star count. If it's 0, then you have a variant that displays 0 stars. If it says 5, then you have a variant that displays 5 stars. So that's the variant type of support that we want to add, and we will be adding.
Okay, so with these variants, I can also start to declare some more adaptive kinds of styles.
Yeah, and so we want to be able to support, we've prototyped supporting conditionals. So you can show different layouts or layout properties based on the variable inputs that you pass. And based on your feedback, Alan, passing in the platform as a variable input, that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm trying to think about how would you envision this to be used? What's like your end goal? Like, can we describe what would be, from end to end to deliver a product, right? From idea to App Store, what would that process look like using Codelessly?
Yeah, great question, Alan. So we don't, our end goal isn't the App Store. We don't want to be, we don't want to be publishing apps for you, really. There's a lot of other companies out there that do that, but I think that's reaching a bit too far. In fact,
what I'm trying to say is, like, I'm curious about, like, if people really want to use this in their work to make life easier, how would this aid, right? So I'm not saying publish it to the App Store for himself. I'm saying, like, from idea to App Store, like the whole process of building an app. How would this tool, where would it be in the process? Would it be maybe in the prototype stage? How much can I do within Codelessly? Like, is there going to be a place where I could just type my Dart code for my business logic within there? That's kind of what I want to see. Like, what's the end? Not like where it is right now, but kind of like where do you envision if in the process. Like, okay, so step one, we have an idea. Step two is probably start to design it. Maybe you can take it from there.
Okay, so we can either talk about Codelessly with AI or Codelessly without AI. But to answer your question right now, and okay, where I envision it to be is you import designs from Figma, and then eventually you can actually just build designs inside of Codelessly yourself. So you'll have your component library, you'll have your design system tied to actual working components that you can just use inside of Codelessly, and then you get a cloud UI output. So you can integrate our cloud UI into your app. So you can publish whatever you see in Codelessly directly to your app, or we will always give developers and our users the freedom to export all of the code. So we want to give developers the power to integrate into their own workflows. And that means you can use Codelessly as much as possible or as little as you want. We want to support a range of outputs.
Based on what I seen last time, I can imagine that, I think I already walked this through with you. So the designer's working very hard on their design. They think it's good to go. They would then import it into Codelessly. And from this point on, I think this is where our views differed, right? I think from here, this is where you were thinking that the developer would then step in and start to connect the design components to actually make them usable. But I was thinking more that the designer, because they already did all the planning, that they would be the one to say, this is a button, this is a whatever, and really start to define how these components work. From there, I mean, I don't think there's no way to actually add in logic, right? It's just that you'd have all the UI, and then it would be exported using that like a window pane, if I remember correctly, where you could just basically copy and paste.
Right.
And that one you would copy and paste it to wherever you're going to be writing your stuff, Android Studio, Visual Studio, and then you would have to continue on your way, right?
Right. So that's the designer to developer handoff. But you mentioned a really good use case where we also want to be able to go end to end in a lot of use cases, because a lot of users, they don't know code. They're actually, if they saw the code, they'd be pretty afraid. They just want to be able to publish this, as a website or publish it as an app. So we want to support that flow as well, but not at the expense of the code. So getting the code right is definitely the top priority. And then our secondary priority is the end-to-end flow, where designers, business users can just build working apps inside of Codelessly without ever having to leave Codelessly.
Yeah, that would be huge, right? I mean, I think that's kind of where we're going these days, is less installation on your local machine.
Mm-hmm.
So even containers, I think, is kind of going to be out of shop, right? Because a lot of these companies, even like Photoshop and like Figma, right? You looking at what you have, as I said, it's like, wow, this looks like looking at Figma already. The way Codelessly works, which that's fine. Like, let's make it familiar, right? That's okay to go that way. We do have a question from friend of the show, John Cumming, in the live chat. He asks, will it be open source?
So our editor won't be open source, but our libraries and our code will be open source. So the code export and the libraries that we use to build Codelessly and we use to build our components will be open source.
And I believe that you're going to be targeting only Flutter Web, right? Or are you actually planning to have a desktop version?
Once desktop is stable, more stable than it is right now, we definitely want to have a desktop app as well, because the desktop app is, I'd say, 20 to 40 times more performant than Flutter Web.
Another friend of the show, Tony Thomas, asks, do you have any funding?
Right now, we're all, I'm self-funding Codelessly. There's a few reasons for that. In right now in this space, it's a really hot space, but the direction that we want to take, and the valuation that we are looking at, right now it makes sense for me to self-fund it for the most part.
Is it? I mean, that's a huge amount of money. Can you give an idea about how much you've invested into this, or is that a secret?
I'd say that's a secret for now, but I hope to reveal it once we launch this product. Once people see like Codelessly and people are able to use it, so people can have an idea of just what it like. What can you do with like X amount of money, and what can't you do with X amount of money? So that might be interesting to give people an idea.
Now, my question is now the how do I say this? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But man, maybe it's just too early. Coffee's still not kicking in. But in any case, yeah, I mean, I'm excited to see this. Oh, actually, here's my train of thought. For 2 years, that's a lot to put into a product, right? So I'm guessing, are you actually using this thing to bring in more revenue for the company by actually developing apps for other people and using this as kind of like a test bed? So it's kind of like dog feeding.
So we won't Codelessly. We're not an agency. We won't compete with developers, and so, which means we won't develop apps for other companies. So no to that question. Right now, we are very close to being able to build a lot of parts of Codelessly in Codelessly itself. And when that happens, that's going to be absolutely huge. In fact, this picture that you have on the screen in front of you, that was all built inside of Codelessly. So we're using it to plan our project roadmap. We're using it for project management, for tracking issues. What's great about building a product like Codelessly is that if you have an issue with Codelessly, you can just create a live demo of that issue inside of Codelessly itself and tag it.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, so it's really great.
So literally, it's kind of a weird thing to think about. Codelessly is building itself, basically.
Eventually, my development philosophy here is that at the end of the day, the only thing we should be working on is the Codelessly editor itself. If we want to have, a support chat, if we want to have a projects page, if we want to have a settings page, we want to build user access controls, all of those business features, we should be able to build it inside of Codelessly. And once we're able to do that, that means that everyone in the world will be able to do that as well. And that's what's really exciting for me.
Yeah, that's definitely exciting. Yeah, I don't think I have any more questions in particular. Is there anything else you wanted to say about Codelessly before we start to sign off?
Right now, you can go to codelessly.com. So code less and then Lee, L-L-Y, .com to sign up for our beta. Yeah, right now our website is in quite a bit of stealth mode, so you won't see much. But if you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll find a few tidbits here and there and a beta invite hopefully soon.
Do you have any idea when the beta will drop and when the final production ready will be ready?
In a month or two, hopefully. But we've been saying that since 2 years ago.
Yeah, there's always something new and always something that kind of comes up, right? And things that you want to change. This is hopefully this will come out within this year, right? I'm hoping so. It looks really exciting.
Yeah, it will definitely come out in 2022, um, in the next few months. We're getting very, very close.
All right, that's good. Yep. Anything else? I just don't want to leave something off the table, but yeah, that's good to drop the link. I already dropped the link into the live chat so people can see it.
We never got to discuss AI. We never got to discuss some software development trends. Oh man, there's so much to talk about. But I guess that's a conversation for next time.
Yeah, we can always have you again to come on, which is I'm totally fine with that. If you when you have some time, we can talk about the AI stuff. Not a lot of people are talking about it, and I think that's when we talked before, right? It's like my time with that was all like, this low code, no code is still not quite there yet, but maybe someday it'll get there, at least enough that you'll get something. There, it depends on what you need, right? The more customized you want, it just probably cannot be done at the current moment. But simple stuff, I think it's fine. There's a lot of tools out there that do this kind of work for you.
Right. What I think a lot of, not to delve into the conversation, but just to uh, like tease it as a spoiler, is a lot of people don't realize that the biggest threat to developers, or the biggest threat to the work that you do, isn't that someone else, or AI will do the work that you're doing. The biggest threat is that this new technology is going to change the nature of the work you do. So, for example, a lot of people, like, say, you have a team of 20 people building an enterprise, um, revenue management system. Well, what's the threat there? The threat from AI is that the AI replaces your entire revenue management system. So now you don't have any software that needs to be developed because the AI is managing your revenue.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's going to be an effect on our process. I can imagine more tools like what you're building will definitely be there. Hopefully that the output will be up to par, right? I mean, we already have like Android Studio. They already have something similar. Well, somewhat. They're in the same realm, I think, where you can kind of drag and drop the component builder, right? And of course, interface builder within iOS is doing similar thing.
Right.
Cool. Yeah, that would be a very interesting topic. I'm more than happy to have you on. You can feel free to schedule when you're free, and we can just discuss about that. I think that would be great.
Yeah. So I have the vision of Codelessly with AI is that we want to collect 40 million design to code conversions, and then build an AI model that can replace step two. So, step one, import from Figma. Step two, tell the design how it works. We want to replace that, and you can do it with AI. So that way you can just take a design and you can tell the design, you can communicate, give it specs, iterate on top of the design, and then the design just instantly works. Um, and we want to collect that data. Um, and I'd love to come back on and show you the roadmap for how AI can automate this part of software development.
That would be a long time coming, because 40 million. I mean, it's going to take a while. The first million will be the longest one, probably, right? The second million, third million, 10 million will be easy after that.
Right. With 40 million, you can build, a model that's pretty much guaranteed to work. Um, But I say that with the same confidence that Elon Musk does when he says self-driving cars are coming, next year.
Well, they're not, from what I've seen, they're not doing too far off from. It's much better than I thought, actually. But yeah, like, we all know that there's a lot of noise that you have to handle, right? A lot of things.
Mhm.
And things are always in perfect condition when you test them out, right? But the world's not perfect.
Right.
Yeah, again, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to Codelessly actually coming out. I didn't sign up yet, but I should sign up so I can kind of keep track about how it's going.
Well, thanks for having me on, Alan.
Yeah, thank you for making time for this, and I appreciate you talking about your product before you even release it yet. It's you could, you may make some pretty bold statements. So hopefully, when it comes out, people don't look back at this and see, is this true what he said? Is this true what he said? So, but otherwise, I've seen it, as we talked about, and I think that it's exciting.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for your time, and yeah, hopefully have you back again soon.
All right, take care.